Good. So, Dr. Goda, fellow panelists and other members of the audience, very good morning to you all from Vellore. So, you got an introduction about me, why I should talk about research. I am coming from two aspects. One is that I have attended a similar research methodology course in 2008, which kickstarted my research ambitions. And even now, when I look back, that is what actually I attribute all the success as well as whatever that has come out of it. And also I have experience having conducted an RCT as a PI. And also more importantly, what I'm going to tell you today is my experience from being a member of the CMCs in IRB. I am a scientific reviewer for the IRB. We meet every month and review all the proposals from the institution. So today, the focus of my talk would be, I was asked to talk about protocol writing, and main part is the study design and the methodology. So I would be telling you what are the elements that should go in, and how to, a few cues as to how to make it impressive, and what does the reviewers look at it, even the scientific as the ethics committee. Because if you know, yesterday we spent time on writing up the introduction as to convince ourselves why we should do this research, why this question is important, and what I'm going to look at. That's done yesterday. Most often when we get papers to proposals to review, the biggest content that we look at is the methodology. So enough importance have to be given to that. And if there are flaws in methodology, we might even not bother looking at your justification. So that is the crux of your research. So that's what I would be talking about. So broadly, research protocols that can be divided as interventional, which we spoke of in the morning, and very nicely Shantam has spoken to us about the observational designs, and the other studies like test of diagnostic accuracy, wherein biomarkers and all will come in cancer research. So as said earlier, the choosing the appropriate design, that depends on mainly on the research question that you are asking. Also, it may depend on the outcome that you are testing, where you are doing the research. Not all designs are appropriate for the setting that you are practicing or doing the research. The time that you have in your hand, obviously the resources in terms of money, as well as the technology that is at hand, the team that you're going to work with. I have seen proposals from yesterday, some of them. There was one from palliative care member who's writing up on radiation oncology. That means he has a strong team of radiation oncology whom he is collaborating with. So team is also important to actually decide your study design, and obviously the sample size. If you are designing a wonderful trial and you're not anticipating to recruit the required sample size, then that design is probably redundant for that particular setting. So all this should decide your design. So I'm not elaborating on the design, because by now you should have an hypothesis which you are convinced about. You have decided the outcomes that you are looking for. You have a broad design idea. You know it is an interventional design or an observational design. You have justified the relevance of your study. You have also justified why you should do this study in your institution, and you have also justified in your mind that how you're going to do it. And I am actually going to tell you how to put it down in a very specific, lucid and clear manner. I cannot cover everything in this 40 minutes that I am given, but I'll try to tell you certain important things that has to be there. And always write up, when you write up, it has to be very lucid and clear. You preferably use illustrations when needed, like algorithms. I will come to it. Use simple languages, and always think the reviewer may not be from same specialty. Okay, especially in CMC, if I'm sending an oncology or radiation oncology proposal, I might get a medicine person to review it. It may not be the same person. So always, when you send it for outside grants also, it has to be, this thing has to be in your mind. Don't expect them to clearly understand the technical terms that you have written down. So please be generous in elaborating it in simple terms. And obviously, one most important thing that you are looking at in a good research protocol is that the researcher has anticipated all the possibilities that can happen in his research, all the things that can go wrong, all the things that the reviewer may ask the question about, all the ethical issues that may arise. You can anticipate all this and then put it down in your design and methodology. Very important. I will come to few of them. So the essential elements that you already have, as we said earlier, are the objectives, the timeline with which you are going to do the research, and where you are going to do the research and on whom you are going to do the research. This is very clear at this point in your mind. So let's take the broad design methods one by one. If I'm to talk about interventional study designs, the interventional designs are basically wherein the focus is on the exposure. When I speak of exposure, I'm not talking about radiotherapy related exposure. The main difference between an interventional design and observational design is that in the interventional design, the researcher is introducing the exposure. It may be a radiation, it may be drug of choice, it may be a knowledge, attitude, practice intervention. So that intervention is called the exposure. In an interventional design, in your methods, the focus is on exposure. That is what you are going to do to that particular population. And some of the essential regulatory framework that has to happen during that particular interventional trial has to be in your mind when you write up the methods. That is, one is in a drug trial, whenever you are testing a new drug or an existing drug for a new indication, or an existing drug for the same indication but a new dose, you might need approvals. Always external grant agencies will look for good clinical practice certification in the researchers. It's very important to get one. It's not difficult to get one certification. And always all human trials would need ethical clearance. All animal studies should need animal ethic clearance. If your institution has them, then you should be getting those clearance. And most often now, interventional studies require study insurance also. So always have this in the back of your mind. These are the regulatory elements that you need in your proposal. So continuing on the essential elements that you need in an interventional design, obviously inclusion and exclusion, I don't have to elaborate on it. But when you write up the inclusion and exclusion, few things that we find in most of the proposals that we review. One is sometimes these inclusions are very strict, like for example, in an oncology clinic, you are only including patients between age of 18 and 70 who doesn't have hypertension, who doesn't have diabetes, who doesn't have some other comorbidities. You are actually refining yourself to a very impractical cohort. So, and even if you do that research, you might be finding some toxicity, and then later when it comes to clinic, you may not be able to accrue these patients in the for treatment. So your research probably becomes redundant. So being pragmatic in your inclusion criteria is very important. Pragmatic is a very common term that is now being used in study design, in statistical design, everything. It just means to include your common sense when you write up your inclusion and exclusion. Mixed designs, there was a question about mixed design, that is, can I combine prospective and retrospective? Yes, as Shantam said, nothing can stop you from doing that. But one of the flaws that we see when we do that is you have the same inclusion and exclusion criteria for both cohorts. Ideally, kindly separate them. You have a separate criteria for prospective and separate for retrospective, unless you are going back in time and doing a prospective study in a retrospective design. Secondary objectives. Obviously, most studies will have secondary objectives, and if needed, please write the inclusion for secondary objectives separately. That also tells the reviewer that you have actually thought about the specifics of it. Then comes defining your exposure, that is the intervention agent. So this definition also has to be very specific in your protocol. Like, for example, you are going to give only IV fluids to a patient during radiation. The intervention is saline infusion given half an hour prior to radiotherapy. Not like that. It should be like intervention is specified as 0.9% sodium chloride, 500 ml infused over 1 hour, half an hour prior to radiotherapy on a daily basis during the course of radiation. So that's a more specific definition of intervention. And obviously, when you say intervention in a intervention design, you need a comparator agent also. So in a randomized control trial, you have already looked at the control, which could be a placebo or another standard of care. Obviously, you have to define the same in the same manner you have put in the intervention. But that doesn't mean that non-randomized control trials does not require comparator agent. In a pre and post design, you have to say it is the same population which is studied before and after the exposure. And in a non-randomized design, you can even actually say that my comparison is with the historical cohort, and that historical cohort has to be clearly defined in your inclusion and exclusion also. Some specific elements that are very particular to the interventional design is one is randomization. You would all know about this at this level, but I'm just running through it. There are various methods of randomization: simple, block, stratified, and adaptive. This is to make sure that every patient, the comparative groups are more or less similar and devoid of bias in recruitment. So most often, whatever randomized control trials that I have used, I have done something called a block randomization. A block randomization just means that at the end of every block, probably at the end of 10 patients recruitment or 20 patient recruitment, I will have similar number of patients in both the control and the study arm. Why do you have to do that? Is to make sure that at any point your study stops early, you still have a similar looking arm on either side, so that you can have at least a meaningful hypothesis generated out of it. Another option is a stratified randomization that is more important in cancer clinics. For example, if I am going to do a study on head and neck cancer radiation, you will have patients with radical intent radiotherapy with and without chemo, patients with post-op radiotherapy with and without chemo. So there are already 4 strata. So you can actually recruit based on stratified block randomization, so that each of these groups are equally represented in your sample size. The question of whether to power each of these groups into your sample is separate, but to make your population similar, this would be a good approach. Along with randomization comes allocation concealment. To put it in simple terms, allocation concealment means when you are recruiting a patient for the study who has consented to your study, you may think this patient is a little weak, may have diabetes, he doesn't look good. So it may be because you are the PI and you are recruiting, you may feel compelled to put him in the control arm and not put in the actual intervention arm. So to avoid such bias, we do this allocation concealment. And one of the simplest allocation concealment is the numbered sequence, wherein you can do this envelope method that you can Google that, or else just have an independent person have the list of allocation with them, and each time you have to recruit, just go and ask him, I have a patient, which group does he go to? And he just looks at the sequence and tells you what it is, so that you don't know, but this person who is having the master sheet will let you know what is the allocation. So that's all simple methods of allocation concealment. Then comes blinding and masking. Not all studies are blinded. Oncology intervention trials, it's very difficult to blind and mask trials. So most of these are open label trials, but you can even do blinding if you have a very good placebo or even called you have very good placebo, or even the observer can be blinded. So for example, what you can do is that you separate a person who actually gives the intervention, and if you are just looking at toxicity between 2 arms, you keep a third person for looking at the toxicity, so he doesn't know which arm the patient belongs to. So that is a method of simple blinding. Why all these are important is that when you report your trials results in a journal, these methods carry weightage, and that is what actually strengthens your result. So we spoke about objectives, and today morning it was shared among the groups what are the differences between objectives and outcomes or endpoints. As based on objectives, we need to have specific quantifiable outcome or endpoints, and the primary endpoint is the one to which the study would be powered for, and it is the most important variable to which your research question is trying to find an answer for. And it is ideally a patient-centric variable. There are secondary outcomes also, or secondary endpoints, which are additional endpoints. They are preferably pre-specified, and most often the trial's sample is not calculated across that. But sometimes if you are asking for budgeting for secondary outcomes also, then it might be nice to actually calculate the sample for that and show that I would still get a good enough answer with the secondary outcome with the proposed sample. Obviously, that brings us to the sample size with rationale. All the statistical part, I think we have 3 more sessions coming up, so I will not go elaborate into it, but I will just tell you in terms of writing up the methods, what is important. It's very important to mention the target sample size with rationale. why, even though you feel that you are going to write it as a convenient sample size, at least in our CMC's IRB, we insist that every proposal comes with a calculated target sample. And with that, we allow them to rationalize and say that why are you under recruiting? It's a very good method, so that you know what is actual that you need to actually prove this. But we may not be able to achieve that because this is a very rare thing. So we would be able to achieve this in 1 year, which we would be sampling for this particular study. So that rationale is important. Also, question of what is the difference that you are going to test between the study and the comparator arm, that justification also should come out here. If you are saying 10% difference, why should you look for a 10% difference? If you're saying 25% difference, why should you look for that? I'll elaborate a bit on that in subsequent slides. And the bottom line message is always calculate the sample. And more on it, statistical analysis plan has to be part of your methods, and it has to be mentioned upfront. What especially in an interventional trial, you have to mention what kind of analysis you will do, whether it's an intention to treat or a per protocol. And this also brings us to very important elements, that is budget with justification, which will be based on each of your objectives also. And finally, this is something we insist in CMC, that is the publication plans. Why is it important? Because you have multiple teams working along with you. It is very important to specify upfront who will lead the research, who will be what author, so that everybody would contribute with an idea in mind. Okay, my work and my contribution is actually will be taken care of in future. So these are certain cues that I am sharing, which probably would be useful for you. And it is also good to include these elements like the date of first enrollment. Though you have set the timeline, you should also have an idea as to which month of the year you're going to start the proposal. So if you're going for a funding agency, you know when the grant is going to come, and you should actually mention this is the month I would start the study, and this is the estimated duration the study would span out. Also mention protocol variation. This is very important to interventional designs, because sometimes we might recruit 25% of the patients and realize that we are not seeing enough events to which the study was powered to. So even if I continue to recruit the remaining 75%, I would probably not reach the endpoint that I have suggested. So in that case, it may not be worthwhile continuing. So it may be anticipated and then written down in your methods. You can even mention very clearly, because of such and such reasons, I am not planning an interim analysis, or there is no premature stopping rules. Even excessive toxicity can be a reason for premature stopping, and that is where the DSMB comes in. That is your Data and Safety Monitoring Board. Most research institutions will have a DSMB setup. Otherwise, you should have people from different neutral individuals, people from different specialties, who would be actually able to look into your data and say that your study is safe to continue. This happens whenever there is an adverse event that happens, and the question goes to the DSMB whether the study is safe to continue, especially important in interventional trials. And post-trial benefits and care, this is one line that most ethics committee looks at. What if it's an intervention that is beneficial to the patient? For example, you are introducing a drug like osimertinib in the trial and is given free to the patient. At the end of 2 years of trial, you have found that many people are benefiting and some are not benefiting. And at the end of 2 years, if the trial is over, what happens to those patients who are benefiting? Are you going to give osimertinib to them or not? So you should be anticipating this, because you cannot say that now trial is over, now you are benefiting with osimertinib, but then now from now on you will have to go and buy it. So that's a very ethical question. So you need to anticipate this and then write it down what you are going to do with these patients at the end of your trial recruitment and is over. Another important element that everybody looks for a quick review whether your study is good or not is a study algorithm. And it's always important to have this made, wherein you actually clearly state the various lines into which your therapy, control arm, study arm goes in. This can happen for all study design, not only interventional study design. This is one of the sample algorithms that I have created for one of my research. Also in interventional design, you can, so all randomized control trials is mandatory to report the consort flowchart at the end of it. So you can actually, to to be impressive as to you anticipate, if you are applying for a randomized control trial, please draw out your consort upfront and keep it ready. Show that this is how I would be analyzing, and you can always mention the intention to treat or per protocol analysis that you would be doing at the end in that. Another important chart that people look for in a proposal is the timeline. This is a sample timeline of a large 5-year trial that we have designed. This is a career grant, so obviously timeline is very important. But for every, this is called a Gantt chart. So for every study that you write up, it is nice to be drawing out a timeline so that you can be impressive with your anticipation of issues with your planning for the reviewer, and that actually increases the chance of you getting a grant. Now, that is mostly about interventional trials. Now, I will briefly tell you about what additional things that an observational design will look at. Always remember, an observational design, the focus is the data. In an interventional design, the focus is on the exposure. In an observational design, the exposure has already happened. You are actually trying to collect very good data devoid of confounders and bias. So that is your focus. So to do that, you have to actually mention the source of data very clearly, very lucidly. What are the variables that may come in? What are the confounders that may happen? What are the methods that you take to reduce the bias? How do you match case and controls? And most importantly, when it is speaking about data, and most often you may not get the entire data that you propose to ask through a CRF. So how will you handle the missing data? How will you handle quantitative variables? All these are very important when you are writing up an observational design. And obviously the sample size and analysis plan is also important in this design too. The third major design that we would write up is the diagnostic tests, prognostic models, and biomarkers, which are now increasingly important. Here, the most important focus when you write up is the test by itself. Obviously, the study population in which the test is conducted is important. Also, how you collect the data from them is also important. But the larger focus is on the test per se. So as in other studies, you mentioned the sample with inclusion and exclusion. Where will you collect data? What is the sampling strategy? And most importantly, what is your reference standard to which your test is being compared to? And in relation to that reference standard, how is your sample selection? How is your data collection different? That is to be identified and then written down very clearly. And also the timeline. Sometimes some of the diagnostic tests start with a positive standard test and then you do the next step. So that also has to be clearly mentioned. Or are you going to go back and then collect the entire group in which the reference standard test was done and then do this test on them? So these differences have to be clearly mentioned when you write up a diagnostic test or a study design on biomarkers. And a few things that are essential, I reiterate. One is the reference standard. That is a standard to which you are going to compare your study, your test to, or the index test to. And if it's an experimental index test, then you should actually contact the lab or the collaborator and get the standard operating procedure, which should be a part of the appendix for the application. And also it is important to mention the training of the personnel who would be conducting the test, which actually tells the reviewer that you have actually anticipated variability in conducting the test. And the skill of the individual conducting the test can also influence that. So you're actually taking away some of the confounders in this. So that brings us to timing of these timing of the test with reference to the reference test. The index test timing with reference to the reference test is very important. And also in this situation also, there might be a situation where you should actually say how you interpret data. That is, if you get the test result, are you going to dichotomously analyze it, or are you going to how are you going to compare it with the index test result? What happens to unclear results? Some of the results may not be yes or no. It might be equivocal. So how are you going to handle that? How are you going to handle missing data? These are also very important things to anticipate and write down in your methodology. One of the important things that you need in a study involving a diagnostic test is the confusion matrix, wherein you are actually, because mostly your comparison with standard tests will be based on sensitivity and specificity. And if you were to look at how much patients you need for these tests, you have to draw up a confusion matrix. And one other thing that you have to focus on is the, sorry for this being blurred, is the false negatives and the false positives. Because whenever, for example, in a biomarker study, which is actually predicting a poor response to a therapy, and you are suggesting that you are going to intensify the therapy, in that case, it is very important to know what happens to the false positives and the false negatives if they are wrongly predicted by your biomarker. That has to be thought through and then written down. So if it is an intensification of therapy, then you can actually keep the false positives high. If the biomarker is predicting for an alternative event of de-intensifying therapy, then your false positives have to be much less. So please go through that confusion metric so that you can think through the process and then write down clearly why you want to keep the sensitivity at this level, keep the specificity at this level for this particular biomarker. Few things from the ethics point of view, what is looked into the proposal is, obviously, you know that a consent is always necessary, which is preceded by an information sheet in the languages that are of importance in the setting that you are conducting the research. It has to be in layman's explanation. And also one thing that they look for is who is going to take the consent and when are they going to take the consent. For example, one of the proposals that I read, there was this suggestion of using intravaginal gel for during MRI to clearly see the extent of the tumor in carcinoma cervix staging. So when are they going to take the consent? The patient's consent will be taken prior to scan. So look at a situation where the patient is coming for an MRI scan prepared, and then you are asking them to sign something and then just go and lie down and take the scan. So obviously they will think, unless I sign this, I won't get the scan. So it's a vulnerable moment. Such situations will be picked up by ethics, and you have to actually specify when and who will take the consent. Ideally, it should be taken not at a vulnerable moment. Maybe when you order the test, you can actually take the consent. Another important thing they look for is the vulnerable groups, that is dependent people, psychiatric patients, etc. Pregnant women all come under vulnerable groups. It's important, even if you feel that they are not going to be part of your recruitment, it's important to write a line saying that no vulnerable groups will be recruited into this trial. Child assent, one of the most important things that have come through in recent times is to get an assent from children. So the ICMR guidelines say that if a child is less than 7 years, you can get parents' consent. If the child is between 7 and 11, in front of the parent, you should get an oral yes or no from the child, which is a child assent. And if it is 11 to 18, a written assent should come from the child. This is apart from the consent of parents. Also important is data confidentiality, anonymization, and traceability. So where you are storing data, how you are storing the data, and how are you going to trace the data, which is important, which needs more time to discuss, but always keep in mind, these are elements that ethics will look for, and probably you should actually write down. The data is stored in this particular computer in this office. It will be coded by this method, and only this person will have the traceability file with them. So that kind of explanation would suffice for the ethics committee. And ethics will also look at the potential benefits and risks to participants. Obviously, if you feel there are certain risks involved, you can actually justify it and write down your proposal so that the ethics will see, oh, is this risk justified for the patient being part of this proposal? If so, they will give you clearance. So anticipate this and write it in layman's language as to whether it's whether the risks are whether the anticipated risks are justifiable. Another thing they look for in budget when you write it up is whether there are any inducements. So for example, in budget, we will write for patients 1 day, if it's a laborer, 1 day's charge amount that he gets from his work, or the travel expenses may be added to it, refreshment expense may be added to it. This should be written that it should not look like an undue inducement. Something like, if you write up as part of being the trial, being part of the trial, you may get these extra tests done. That is an inducement. So this has to be justified. So it should not look as an inducement, especially in your information sheet. And whatever you are doing for the patient has to be justified. Now, the last 5 minutes, I will just go through a few unique situations and decisions that have come through my research proposal applications. And first and foremost is this trial, which was a double-blinded randomized control trial, which I did on cervical cancer. Very good design if I look back. And this was my first major grant, which I got in 2010. And in 2011, I was asked to go in front of the grant agency to present the progress. And being a being a young researcher, not much guidance, I actually looked up what happened to all the 20 patients that I had recruited, nicely put up graphs, analyzed, and then presented in front of them. And the one question they asked at the end of that is that, who is your DSMB? And I didn't know what DSMB was. And they told me that CMC Vellore should definitely have a DSMB. Who asked you to look at the data? So that's when I realized that in a double-blind control trial, a DSMB is important, and I am not supposed to break the codes and look at. And finally, what happened? I had to restart the trial at that point. So you may face certain obstacles, which may be due to your mistakes or something else, but you should be able to gather yourself and start off again. And another important thing was in design of this IV fluid study, wherein we wanted to give 1 unit of IV fluid for head and neck cancer patients prior to radiation, just to offset their background dehydration so that their reactions are lesser. So the question in our research team was that, shall we just include oropharyngeal cancer patients who are undergoing chemo-RT alone? So then we thought of, if you are going to keep our inclusion to a specific group, at the end of it, we find that only these group are benefiting. How will I use it for post-op patients? So finally, our inclusion was made more generous. Like any patient who is undergoing radiation for head and neck cancer, we made it more pragmatic. And what went along with that, as I mentioned above, was a stratified randomization strategy, so that at the end of the sample, I'll have enough people of each class or each group to analyze and match the control and the study groups. And another important thing was the point of consent. So this is another unique thing, that you may be introducing one intervention and in the other arm there is no intervention. That is, in this particular study, I'm giving IV fluid for 30 days to one set of patients, and another set of patients doesn't get anything other than their standard of care treatment. So if I am to approach the patient to say that I am going to randomize you to one of these arms, in one arm you will get IV fluid, are you ready for it? And he may say yes, and then I randomize and tell them, sorry, you are in the control arm, you are not going to get anything. The patient is going to get disappointed. So this problem I presented to the ethics committee, and I requested them, can I take the consent after the randomization? So the ethics elaborated on this, and then they said, see, if you do that, what happens is that you are going to say that this is the patient for IV arm. After you randomize and you ask for consent, and the patient says no, you may have excessive dropouts in the IV arm. So I was told, you run the study with this method, where you have suggested that you take consent after randomization. At the end of 6 months, come back to us. If there is more than 10% dropouts, we have to go back to the other strategy. So my message being, see, you don't have to really stick to convention. If you feel that certain things are justifiable, it is always free to actually write it down and ask the scientific and the ethics committee for approval. It's always rationalizable. Another study is the PRAGRAD study. So here the question was, I wanted to, like shared yesterday, there's advanced inoperable oral cavity cancer, which Tata Group has studied extensively. We wanted to see whether the good performance one can go for radical radiation or for palliative radiation, whether there is a difference. The ideal design for this would be to actually do a randomized control trial. But if you look at a randomized control trial, you are actually recruiting a patient and telling them, see, you agree for the study. If you agree, I will either give you full course radical radiation, or I'll give you a little bit of radiation or medicines alone. So there is a greater imbalance between the two arms. So it's not probably ethical to approach a patient with such a design. So I had to actually change over to an observational design, which also means that if it is a standard of care, the funding would be lesser in an observational design. It did take a little bit of discussion to get the ethical clearance, but finally we could change that from a randomized design to an observational design, and this is the protocol for the observational design. Finally, when I spoke of biomarkers, this is one major study that we do on biomarkers in predicting 1 year failure-free survival in locally advanced head and neck cancer following radiation. So this is the confusion metrics that I was saying. In this, we are suggesting intensification of therapy by use of biomarkers, and hence we kept the false positives high. And also another important thing that we thought of here is that there is a training subset and a validation subset. So when you do a study over 5 years, recruiting patients over 5 years, your technology can change over a period of 5 years. So it's very important to actually allocate enough patients from each year to go into your validation cohort. Otherwise, you may still have bias due to the time trends that may come into your validation. The technology that you use for training cohort would have gone off, and a new technology has come in. So there might be a bias in that. So that's more or less what I wanted to share with you. This is my FLIMS 2008 picture, and what happened to that proposal. Sadly, that proposal, I later realized that it wasn't very feasible, and it ended up being a case series. But did that benefit me? It didn't benefit the proposal that I developed in the research methodology workshop. But the next one that I developed was the one which I utilized the efforts from FLIMS, the learning from FLIMS, and that is what took me to a higher level, and it actually ended up getting me an award at ESTRO. So it is not about the proposal that you are probably developing, it is about the lessons that you take here and about the future proposals that you would make from those. I thank the CMC IRB for most of the information that I share with you are from the discussion that we have in IRB, and I thank them profusely. And this is a picture of CMC that I would leave you with. Thank you.